want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're going to do a session talking more about devices and templates because I've had some additional questions come up since our last session. As always, if you do have questions outside of these sessions, feel free to reach out to us and our team, and we're happy to get you answers ahead of time. But we want to make sure that we're making this available and official throughout. Um, we do expect that we're going to have some time for questions and answers at the end of this session, so please, if feel free to bring that up if there's anything we discuss on this call, either if it relates directly to devices and templates as we'll be discussing them today, or if it's more generally about the UC. So the goals for the session today is we're going to be reviewing the range of TO devices. We're going to define and discuss configuration options, and this is really the core of why we're talking about this today. Is in the bringing up the UC from scratch training, we talked about the different device types and using templates and all of that to be efficient on it. But one of the things we didn't go into detail on is some of the differences between these devices. So we're going to go through our different generations of models, with the most focus being on the new tree line, but going through everything you might find yourself with on a TOUC deployment. And talking about what the differences are, what the capabilities are, and some of those best practices as we come into play. We continue to tweak these sessions as we go forward, so the goal with this one is to be a little bit shorter than previous ones. Like I said, we should be leaving plenty of time for questions as we go on. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about what we call our tree models or the digital forest line. If I'm getting that right, Deirdre, you can let me know if I'm getting the messaging wrong and fix myself on the spot here. And so that's specifically the TO Fir and TO Cedar models. When we think about these phones, from a functional perspective, as we see them deployed on the UC today, they're almost identical. Biggest difference is number of keys and some ancillary components such as the size of the speakerphone. Both the Fir and the Cedar are configurable with a large number of multifunction keys and are focused on being that main phone for a workforce. The Fir is going to fill that much more common use case of I need to have some speed dial keys, I need to be able to make and receive calls, and it even works for power users in a lot of cases. They're both going to have Bluetooth, they're both going to have the ability to use an electronic hook switch with their headset if they're plugged in that way and using something from, say, Poly. They both have intercom features and multicast capabilities. The biggest difference comes into play when we get to these function keys. When we're taking a look at the Fir, you have a total of 4 function keys on the main display, and then the remaining 30 keys are all on the sidecar in up to 5 pages as you work through that list. The Cedar, for those of you who haven't seen it, is, as you can tell from just the small picture here, significantly larger. We have a total of 10 keys on the main display and a total of 106 keys. So that's 10 on the main display and 96 keys across 3 pages on the secondary display. This TO Cedar phone is really going to be focused on those people who, for other systems or other deployments, you would be putting on an additional sidecar in order to allow them to see a status of different users or just have that number of speed dial keys. But that being said, when we come to configure these, the functionality between the two is going to be identical when it comes to the individual components. So once we've learned one, we know both of them. As a reminder, on the template side, for any of the templates we work with, we have some basic properties and a history element on here. So we can come in, we can see the name. This is the default template, so it's just named default. But you will see we've also created other templates on this system, and with notes of what we're doing on here. If you recall from previous sessions, I am a strong proponent of always using the notes fields, always putting informative names in there, because it really helps you if you come back in 6 months or a year and you're like, okay, well, what did I set users up as? What am I doing here? What did I do previously? And it can give you a lot of information about what's going on and how a particular template is being used. But every other tab you're going to see throughout is going to differ slightly based on the model we're looking at. So the general tab is going to be shared between most physical devices, but will look different for our soft phones that we'll be talking about a little bit later today. Network tab, again, is going to be pretty similar across most of the physical TO branded devices, but there are some differences between the Tree models, the 9100 series, and the older, what we'll call the Tone Commander models, the 4101, 4104, 7810, and 7810 TSG. Function keys in terms of a physical appearance is going to look the most similar, but when we actually get into working on function keys, like we will in a couple of minutes here, that's where you're going to see a lot of the differences in capabilities really come through between these different phones on here. Um, for example, a TO Fur or TO Cedar can do a lot more uh, with its function keys in terms of setting additional capabilities like lock the phone, easier to access voicemail, and multicast that the older 4100 series and 7810 series does not support. And then finally, there's going to be multicast. Multicast you're only going to see on the last two generations of phones. So this is going to be the Tree model and the uh, 9100 series. But this allows us to configure listeners for both that 9100 series and for the Tree series of phones. When we're talking about multicast here, we're specifically talking about multicast audio using, for these models, a G711 MULA PCMU as the codec. I bring that up because while this is configuration that we're looking at here is specific to these models, this is an industry standard, and so it can be used to tie in with overhead paging systems um, and other platforms that might need to be sending out that audio. So it's not specific and locked down to just these particular TO phones. We interoperate with most of the major platform vendors out there. So that being said, I'm going to hop back over to keys. And again, as a reminder here, when we're taking a look at keys, the Fur and the Cedar are going to have the same number of keys or the same type of keys. The difference is in number. For most templates and most deployments, when you come into it, originally it's going to start with a key type set to none. This is nothing configured on this line. It's left blank, and it's free for you to set as needed. When we come in here and we select type, you'll be presented with the types of lines that or types of keys that the particular phone model supports. I'm going to give a detailed definition as we go through each of these ones here. And then that way, when we look at other models, um, as we work the way through the rest of the session, I'll only highlight what has changed. I'm not going to highlight details again, just in order to save some time and save some repetition. We've got a call pickup key. So a call pickup key allows us to put a feature activator key on a phone that sets up for call pickup. In a lot of cases, this is a feature that you're not going to see used too commonly, especially on a phone like a Fur or a Cedar, because they do have a large enough number of keys that you can operate instead by using the DSS BLF key, which will directly monitor the phone or a individual extension, and when pressed is going to automatically form a call pickup if that phone is in a ringing state. Um, we do allow this call pickup feature here though, because there are some cases where you want to make it easy to pick things up, and it's easier for either matching what the customer was used to in their previous system, or they have some other types of deployments. The newer phones have the ability to lock their screen. By default, you can also enable this by holding down the pound key. If we were to take a look at a physical phone, either the Fur or the Cedar, you'll actually see next to the pound, there's this same lock icon. This is going to lock the phone keypad. One note on here is that if we come back over to the general side, and again, this is where you start to see some of those differences between model generations, is that lock is only going to do anything if you've enabled the lock password. So that's a 0 through 6 digits to allow it to lock the phone, unlock the phone. Um, if that is not set, doing a lock on the phone is going to show a lock, but as soon as you enter anything, it'll let you unlock. Locking is generally going to be used for common areas where you don't want people using the phone without permission. Um, but more commonly, what we'll see instead, rather than using a lock, is you're going to be using our different dialing modes. Uh, when we take a look at dialing modes here, we've got normal, warm dial, and hot dial. We've briefly touched on this before, but as a reminder, normal is our standard dialing mode that you're going to see across any of the physical desk phones. This is you pick up the handset or you go into a speakerphone or headset mode. Once you hear dial tone, we start a timeout counter and you dial the number you're looking to do. You then wait for that timeout to end. You hit OK, you hit send, you hit call, depending on the exact way you're interfacing with the phone, and the call goes out. We also highly recommend the use of what we call the pre-dial functionality, where instead of going off hook first and hearing the um, pardon me, instead of going off hook and hearing dial tone first, you can dial the number before making a selection of headset versus handset versus speakerphone. And in that case, when you've done that, you're going to dial out right away. That is our recommended kind of default behavior. And most people these days are used to doing that from their cell phone. So we can simply, when we're training the end users, we usually state it as you dial us the same way as you dial your cell phone, dial the number, and then hit call or dial the number and then pick up the handset and you're ready to go. But there's cases where you want the phone to do a little bit more or you want to do a little more automatically. First case that you're going to see here is going to be your warm dial. You'll notice that selecting warm dial, we've added in that destination field on here. And this is a number that the phone's going to automatically dial when it picks up and hits that timeout value. This would, for example, if we configure this down and set it up to go to, we'll just make up a destination of 1000 here. If I was to pick up this phone, wait 4 seconds, it's going to automatically call extension 1000 and follow the call flow from there. However, if I was to start dialing instead, it's going to let me dial a given number. This is going to be used in cases where you want to provide access for a phone to dial an individual party if that party's extension is known, but allow the user to just pick up the handset and wait for a couple seconds if they need assistance. So there's some common areas where we do this are going to be things like tying in with a door phone or in a lobby environment. The other state where we have is going to be our hot dial. Hot dial, you'll notice we completely remove the timeout value here. Hot dial turns this phone into a very basic feature set, which is all it's going to do is dial the destination. As soon as you select a line, as soon as you go off hook or choose your speakerphone or headset if that's enabled, it's going to dial the number there. No timeouts, no waiting, it just goes. Now, we do support this across most models of phones. I will note that generally when you're deploying to a customer, you're not going to want to use a Cedar for this purpose because it's larger and more capable than what you'd need for that case. But we do see this deployed with FIRS or even a 9102, which we'll talk about in a little bit here, much more commonly. So coming back over to our feature keys, we talked about call pickup, we talked about lock, and again, lock lets you lock out a phone, but just as we talked about here, more commonly, rather than locking out a phone, really what you want to do is set specific behavior, or at least that's what we see when working with our customers and working in the field. So while lock is a nice option, more commonly, if it's in a shared or public area, people are going to be using that warm dial or hot dial mode. Setup phone is something that's going to be only on the 9100 series phones and the Tree phones as we're looking at here. What this does is it effectively tells the UC, don't configure anything for this line. In fact, if you were to take a look at the XML config or the configuration file that is generated for this, you'll actually see that it omits any key that is set to set at phone. This allows cases where you might want to let a user manually make a change to the key directly from their phone And if they set it there, just leave it there. Don't make any difference. Don't make any change. Um, there's some benefits to doing this, especially if we're looking to do something a little more flexible, or you're looking to define a very specific key type that one of the pre-built ones we have in here you'd like to add some additional tweaking to, but this is not something we'd normally deploy widely. But this, I think of this kind of as an escape valve. If there's something we need to do that the UC is not configuring just the way you want, we can set the key at phone, override that behavior. Positive thing about that is once you set it, the phone's going to retain that setting. The downside is the only way you're going to adjust that is either at the phone or through the phone's own web UI instead of um, through the UC, and that you won't have visibility at the UC into what that key is set for. So it gives you some flexibility, but you do sacrifice a little bit of visibility and a little bit of control, at least if you're remote. Headset is, we've just found cases where even though there is a dedicated headset key on these phones, and there's a little headset icon that looks very similar to the key we have here, uh, generally just below the voicemail key, there's cases where we want to make it a little more explicit or we want to put that key option somewhere else. And this is just going to toggle your headset. So this is going to pick up your headset, hang up your headset. It's the same as that dedicated key that's on there. But again, if someone's going off of muscle memory or you want to have a label on there rather than just the icon to make it really clear what it's doing for a user, we give you the ability to put that key in here as well. Again, just like a lot of these that we're looking at today, it's really going to depend on your end user expectations and what you find is the best way to support those users. And we want to give you the flexibility to do that here. DSSBLF keys are one of the most common key types you're going to see assigned. And this is going to be true across all the desk phone models we're going to be discussing today. DSSBLF key has two elements to it, a label and an extension. And generally when you're setting that up, rather than having to remember the extension and type it in directly, you can go into your search, select the user that you want to monitor. It'll pre-populate both a label and extension for you and allow you to modify and update from there. So a DSSBLF key, it's going to give you dialogue states on the phone. So you're going to see, are you on hook? Is it ringing? Are you off hook? Visibility, so you can tell whether it's safe to give someone a call. You can activate the direct call pickup, which is same as using that call pickup feature, but integrated into a single key when you know the phone is ringing. And gives you some more flexibility there. This can monitor any internal extension in the system that you see. So anytime you're setting up for an internal user, you're generally going to be selecting DSSBLF key. You could, of course, be selecting a basic speed dial key. You'll notice that when we come into here, speed dial keys are much more pared down. All they are is dial the number that's configured. We can put in a label as well. We can put in the number as dialed, and it'll go. As with elsewhere in the system, when we provide features for a user to dial or forward to, this needs to be a number that the user can reach by looking at our outbound dialing plans and privileges. So it can't be a number they're not allowed to dial. It won't circumvent that check. And it needs to match how they need to dial it. So for example, if you're doing an deployment where the customer requires a leading 9 to get to the outside world, and you're putting in a speed dial key for an external destination, we'll need to make sure that the 9 is placed in here as well. So speed dial keys are as basic as you can get. You put a label on it, you put where you're ringing, and when the user hits that, the phone dials. Whether it dials off of a speakerphone or whether it dials off of a headset is going to be based on what's up here. Is going to be based on this general section and voice mode. So in a handset mode, we're going to assume that your default behavior is to use the handset on the phone. And if you select a line or otherwise make a call without picking up the handset, you're going to be wanting to use a speakerphone. Headset instead says there's a headset connected to this device, and again, on these newer models, that can be Bluetooth, that can be USB, that can be an analog uh, headset. Uh, there's a headset connected to this device, and when I do anything that goes off hook, default to going to that headset first. Of course, in both of these models, you can, if you're in a headset mode, you can still pick up the handset and use it that way. And if you're in a handset mode, you can still select that headset either by using the built-in key or an additional key that's been added on there. But that does change those defaults. So coming back in here, DSS, BLF, and speed dial keys are both going to follow whatever that mode is, as well as a manually dialed outbound call is going to follow whatever that mode is. We default everything to a handset because that's going to be your most common out-of-the-box deployment, but it's just that one radio button to switch it over to a headset mode. For the DSS and BLF key, as well as for the speed dial, if the monitored extension or the destination is idle, they're going to behave exactly the same. If I press a DSS BLF key for that extension, or if I press a speed dial key for that extension, they're both going to speed dial that extension. The difference really comes into play when the monitored extension on a DSS BLF key is in a ringing state. If we see that ringing state, the phone will get that message that whatever's being monitored is ringing. And while in that ringing state, it's going to do, again, a directed call pickup to grab that ringing call. This is one of the reasons why we generally restrict and have restricted these DSS BLF keys to admin only in the past, because we want to make sure that you as an administrator or your customers as an administrator are picking who can pick up which keys or which calls. Voicemail, similar to our headset mode, there is a dedicated physical voicemail key on most TO phones, but we've got keys available. And just like with headsets, sometimes people like to have a key to go directly through here. The other nice advantage of having a voicemail key on here on the Fur and Cedar phones is that the key itself will light when there isn't a voicemail, in addition to your general message waiting indicator in the upper right-hand corner of the phone. Call park is one of those ones that's going to differ the most based on the models we're looking at. The Fur, Cedar, 9104 and 9160, which again are phones that we're not expecting to see as much anymore in new deployments, but we're going to cover anyway in case you're supporting a customer who already has those deployed. Handle park with a single park key. This does a dialogue subscription to a park location and an initial call or transferring a call to a park location that's not in use is going to park that call, and then using that key when you show that that park location is in use is going to dial the pickup code and pick up that call for you. This can also be done manually and actually split up into two different keys if it's easier for your customers or your users to do by just doing speed dial keys on here. But do want to make sure that we call that out. The older models, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes here, have those park and unpark features as two separate keys. So it does behave a little bit differently. Same general concept of you take a call, park it into a location, and then you retrieve it from that location, either on the same phone or a different phone, in order to continue the conversation. But some of the details on how you interact with that will differ between models. Line keys are very different between the Fur and Cedar and the 9100 series phones as compared to the older Tone Commander models. For the newer phones, a line key is technically optional. It makes it a lot easier to manage held calls and a lot easier to switch between call states, which is why we do default our deployments to have, as you see here, 4 line keys on the Fur and 5 on the Cedar, because it does make call handling easier. But you can actually handle calls independently of this as well. We'll talk more about the differences between this and the Tone Commander phones when we get to it at the time. But this just lets you access the line, same as if you dialed and went off hook. If you've got a call on hold, it's going to sequentially start with the first line in here, and then you place your second call, it'll be the second line, and you can hold multiple calls, have inbound calls, transfer out, all through use of these line keys. As a convention, we generally recommend making these line keys a contiguous block because we find that's easiest for the users to understand, but there is not a strong requirement for that. If you've got a case where you'd like to have a line key on the left-hand side of the CEDARS display and the right-hand side of the CEDARS display, that is supported, that will work. It just might throw your users off. So again, we, as a convention, stick with having them all contiguous together. A none, which is our default state, is just going to say there's nothing on this key, and if anything had previously been set on this key, wipe it out. This is usually, or this is going to be your default case, and this just makes sure that the phone doesn't or isn't having any other lingering settings if you've repurposed or changed how a phone is being configured. And then finally, there's multicast. This is used to enable outbound multicast messaging. We give it a label, we give it a multicast IP, and we give it a port. For the port, we require that it be 1025 or higher. Technically, the phones can support lower ports than this, but we have limited that intentionally for better compatibility with certain network equipment as well as for other manufacturers' devices when it comes to working with multicast. That IP address, again, is going to be the multicast range. If you're looking for specific recommendations, the installation manuals for our phones have a large section on this, including what we recommend as our start and end ranges for the IP address and port. You can configure a multicast key completely independently of a multicast listener. So with a multicast key, this is going to be the ability to send an outbound multicast stream or page. But setting up a key here is not going to make the phone listen to multicast. So that way, if you have a case where, say, you have someone at a reception desk that needs to be able to page a warehouse, they can have a key that pages the warehouse, but they're not going to get the warehouse pages at the same time. So it gives you that flexibility. When we work with multicast, this is one of the places where we highly recommend using a template like we're working through today rather than setting it manually because it is just an IP and port. Typos are going to be something that if you hit there, you're going to be scrambling and running through and trying to figure out, okay, what's wrong here? Do I need to do a stare and compare? Whereas if we do it with a template, we make sure we get it right the one time and it applies out everywhere. So this is going to be the key types again, just to wrap up for the Fir and Cedar. We'll take a look at the 9100 series phones in a moment. They're going to be largely similar to this, and then we're going to wrap up our discussions on the desk phones by taking a look at the older 4100 series and 7810 series, which take a different approach to their keys. Last thing I want to discuss when it comes to these phones, as I mentioned briefly before, is the multicast paging. There's multicast, again, is split up into two parts with senders and receivers. This multicast tab for these devices, and again, this is going to be a 9102, 9104, 9160, Fir, or Cedar that support this. The multicast tab configures the listeners, and if you assign a multicast key, that's a sender. So that means, for example, that a 9102, because it doesn't have any multifunction keys, can be assigned to listen to a multicast page, but cannot originate one. Whereas all those other models, because they do have the capability to set multifunction keys, can both send and receive pages. For all of these models, there's some common shared configuration elements between them. First up here is we have the ability to set prioritized lists and configure where a individual call comes into that priority list compared to a page. So if I tell it to use a prioritized list, what's going to happen is it's going to actually follow these listeners in order, which allows me to say have multiple pages occur at once and tell the phone which stream to prioritize. So if there's someone doing a regular page and then we defined, for example, an emergency page up here, even if that other page is in progress, an emergency page, is if you have your priority enabled, is going to actually be able to come in and override that other page that's coming through as long as it's higher up in this listeners list. Normal call priority by default is going to be this disabled state, which is kind of an awkward phrasing until you understand exactly what we're doing with this. But this says, do I consider a call as part of my paging priority list or not? If it's disabled, then a page will never override a call. There's no way for a call to be interrupted if a page occurs. If it is set to any of these other values, it goes into the same list as if it was a listener down below. And then any page that comes in at a higher value than what we set here will actually place the call on hold, play the page, and then return to the call. So for example, here, if we were making this our emergency page, if I set my normal call priority to 2, if I was on a phone call and there was an emergency page that went out, that emergency page would override the audio that I am getting from the phone call. So I can make sure to configure it to make that audible. We support up to 10 multicast listeners per device. In most cases, most deployments, you're going to see 1, 2, or maybe 3 listeners typically used. Now, that may differ based on pardon me. That may differ based on departments and locations. So you could have, like going back to that example where we have a warehouse page. You might have a couple different zones of that warehouse that you possibly want to page differently. So you could have, for example, a receiving page group that plays on the phones closest to the receiving dock. You might have an all warehouse page group. You might have a security page group that goes to anybody near an external door. We've seen a lot of different deployments here. Our goal is to be flexible and to let you define what makes sense rather than forcing you too far down an individual path. Again, just like with the senders when it comes to multicast, these listeners are defined by a label, an IP address, and a port. As a general practice, and again, this is covered in the install manuals for the phones as well, we would recommend using a different IP, a multicast IP per page group. This isn't always going to be necessary, but especially if you're bringing in a third-party device like a overhead speaker that you're integrating in with this multicast paging, we find it generally gets better results and better performance if you use a different multicast IP and port for each of your zones. So you can tweak that. You can work with what makes sense for you, but that's what we found has worked best. So that's a deep dive over those fir and cedar models. Again, this is the majority of what we're shipping these days. This is what we expect you to see for most new deployments. And the key difference between the fir and the cedar is going to be the number of keys. Again, the cedar has a total of 10 keys on the main display and 96 keys across 3 pages on the secondary display. The fir has 4 keys on the main display and a total of 30 keys across 5 pages on its secondary display. So outside of that, everything else we're looking at here, from voice modes and dialing modes to network settings, function keys, and multicast, are going to be equivalent. One thing I didn't touch on too much here is the network screen. We'll be building a separate session to talk more about networking in the UC and networking and TO phones. So we will cover this more as a follow-up. But I did want to acknowledge that we have not gone into detail on this today. That being said, let's go ahead and very briefly touch on the 9100 series phones here. What we have is a 9102, a 9104, and a 9160. These phones going model to model differ much more than what you're going to see between that fir and the cedar. A 9102 is a basic two-line phone. So general settings are going to be very similar. As I mentioned, the 9102 is a common phone we just see deployed in a shared or public area for a hot dial functionality. Um, Network settings are going to be the same, but you'll notice all that's on here for the function keys are your line 1, line 2. And there are 2 physical keys on this phone that are labeled L1, L2. You can technically override this functionality, as you can see if I come in here, but as a best practice, we'd recommend keeping these as just your line 1, line 2, uh, to make it easier for your users to use. The 9102 is not something you're going to see deployed in great volumes, but it is an option if, like I said, for those common areas or cases where they just need dial tone and there's not a lot of other needs on there. Does support multicast, the same capability set as just covered with the fir and cedar. The 9104 was the previous workhorse phone and is most similar to the fir as we compare it here. There are a couple key differences though. So features such as networking and the general are going to be the same. When we come over to function keys, you're going to see a fewer keys. So the fir did not have any keys on its primary display. Instead, it had a couple dedicated physical line 1, line 2 keys, and everything else is in the sidecar. Other differences and why we phased out the 9104 for the fir is headset support was significantly less. You had the ability for an analog headset jack with optional electronic hook switch, but you couldn't use a USB headset, and there was no built-in Bluetooth capabilities, both of which are present in the fir. So the fir is just really a drop-in upgrade replacement for the 9104. If the 9104 is predominantly what you're used to, there's some other niceties that come in with the fir too, and generally it's a newer phone with all the benefits that come from being a newer phone. The reason I want to touch on the 9104 briefly is because if you are supporting installs that have been out there for a while, this was our most widely sold phone for a period of years, and so it is one you might still run into in the field. Feature set wise, this is going to be just about identical to what you can do on the fir and cedar. So you still got your call pickup and lock and set up phone behavior, still got the same headset, DSS, BLF, and speed dial, voicemail, multicast, park, line, and none. Keys are organized a little differently. And if we come in and take a look at details on here, the way a headset key presents on a 9104 is going to look a little different than it does on the fir. But generally, once you know one, it's directly transferable knowledge to the others. 9160 is the last one in the 9100 series lines. I'm just going to touch on this very briefly because this is a device that we're seeing phased out at this point, so I don't expect to see these in new deployments. And generally, this is being superseded by a combination of the cedar with the move back to physical buttons and soft phone or voice operator panel on a PC. The 9160 was a touchscreen video phone that was capable of having a large number of keys on a display, but it was all virtual keys, all touchscreen based. Conceptually, a lot of what we're looking at here is going to be very similar to what you'll have seen on the other 9000 series and First and Cedar. But there are a couple differences. One of the big differences is, again, you get a huge number of keys on here. Because it is all virtual, you can have up to 140 keys. Only the first 8 are displayed on the default view. Everything else you have to page through to get to. There are a couple differences as well. Because this does support video, these phones, if you ever do run across them, have two flavors of DSS-BLF and speed dial. So they have both a standard one, which is going to initiate an audio call, and then they also have video modes, which instead of placing an audio call, places a video call. In practice, we don't see this video mode deployed very frequently. Generally, if someone's doing video, we're going to be doing that with a soft phone, either on a Windows PC, a Mac, or an iOS or Android device. But these phones do support it, and if you ever do come across a key set for video, I want to make sure I call out that difference here. A couple other differences in terms of helper keys. On the other phones we've looked at and these series, they haven't had a redial option because that's on screen and a dedicated physical key. Whereas the 9160, because it is all screen, didn't have a dedicated physical key for it, and therefore you can define a separate redial key. And then most of your other functionality is going to be equivalent through here. So I just want to call out those differences if you do find yourself supporting one of those phones. Multicast configuration is the same. Again, this isn't something I expect you to see going forward with new installations, but it is out there in ones and twos for older installs, so we want to make sure we cover it in this session today. Last thing I want to touch on for all the models we just looked at is coming back over to this general section and the admin access. Every phone we've looked at so far today is capable of having a built-in, being partially managed through a built-in web interface. From here, we can configure what that password is. The default is just admin to get in. We do recommend for production deployments, changing that to a more secure value. You can use the same shared one across all of them, but we do recommend going in and changing that template so your users aren't going to get in unless you've explicitly given them information to access. And then the menu password is what allows them to get into the advanced menu options on any of these phones directly through the phone itself. Again, what you're looking at here is a default value, which we're on a development system, so we've kept everything as default for things like that for ease of access since my engineers are in this so frequently, but this is something we would also recommend changing to a value that you know and can optionally share with your end users if needed. Admins are, of course, able to come in and see this and change this, but this is not something that is exposed to an end user unless you choose to give them that information. What I'd like to do is wrap up now with a quick review of what I'm going to call the Tone Commander phones. The reason I'm calling them Tone Commander phones is because Tone Commander, as a separate entity, is still making and manufacturing several of these models, and they use a common shared firmware. So understanding one is going to give you most of the understanding of every other model. You're going to have a 4101, 4104, 7810, and 7810 TSG set. The most common one you're going to see in the field if you are supporting these, and Frank, if you're on the call, I know that this is something that you can run through with your eyes closed at this point. It's going to be that 7810 TSG. TSG certification is what's called an on-hook secure state. So these phones have actually been certified for deployment in sensitive and classified information facilities, or SCIFs, because they've been validated as when the handset is in the cradle, you are not able to eavesdrop on the phones. You're not able to, even if you go down to listening to the copper itself, you cannot get audio out of these phones. And if you've got a two-line copper connection into a rock, you can get audio out of those. So there's some specialized hardware and specialized functionality inside those TSG phones that still see them commonly deployed today. Functionality-wise, outside of that, these TSG models are going to be almost identical to a standard 7810, so we're going to cover them as one. There are a couple key differences. One is the TSG models, because they are on-hook secure, are also a monitor-only speakerphone. So they have a speaker, they can play outbound audio on it. They physically do not have a microphone except the one that is on the handset. So unless a handset is picked up or a headset is used, There is no other way to get audio out of that TSG set. The 7810 itself does have a dedicated speakerphone option. The other difference is the TSG technically comes in multiple different varieties. From a configuration standpoint, we don't need to worry about that. We can provision them all equivalently, which is why you see them set here. But there is both a A and a B model, which has to do with how power is and network is supplied to that phone. And there are different certification requirements for each. The A model is able to be deployed if the switch is inside or outside of a SCIF environment. But in order to do so, has an additional direct disconnect box built in there. So if the phone loses power, it requires a physical relay to be pressed on the back of the phone to allow it to come back up. So if someone's in there messing with an Ethernet cable and unplugs it to remove power, and the phone loses commercial power as a result of that, the user is going to know, oh, my phone powered off. Let's make sure everything's right before I bring it back on. That's just another anti-tamper, anti-eavesdropping feature. The B series, because that one is deployed where the switch itself, and in this case, I'm talking about an Ethernet switch that's delivering power over Ethernet as well as data connections, is inside the SCIF itself, and so that direct disconnect mechanism is not required. Has all the other protections against audio leaking, but it doesn't have that additional model in there. Again, the 7810 is what you're going to see most of today. 4101 was the entry-level phone for this generation of phones here. A basic 10100 phone with 7 multifunction keys that were effectively speed dials only. Unlike every other phone we've looked at here, those keys did not have a label on them whatsoever. So you just had your M1 through M7 keys, and you would have to train a user on what those did. This was, again, just like we saw with the 9102, more commonly used as a door phone or somewhere where people just need dial tone. From a networking perspective, these phones are going to be very similar to what we'll talk about with the newer models. The biggest difference is they have a different method of handling their SIP proxy servers, and so you can actually have up to an ordered list of up to 10 destinations here, while for the other models, we generally limit that to 2 with a recommendation to use other, usually DNS-based approaches if we want to support more capabilities than that. 4104 was a previous workhorse of that generation. It was a 4 lines on the primary, and then it had 12 multifunction keys. This one, as you might be able to see from the small picture up here, was a paper labels. So definitely from a different era compared to what we're taking a look at with the 9100 series or the Fur or the Cedar. But could do everything that a 7810 could do. A couple things I'll call out briefly here. I mentioned this earlier, but when we're taking a look at these line keys, like I said, for the other models we've already discussed, the lines don't have to be contiguous. In fact, the phone will function, although it might throw the users off, the phone will function without a line key set for any of its multifunction keys. So again, we still recommend it for a user experience, but there's a lot more flexibility there. For the Tone Commander firmware, a line key is required. And if you want to have more than one appearance of a given line, you use this additional line feature. You do not define it as a separate line key. So when I come in here, you'll see there's an option for a line or additional line. Additional line is going to take a look at the key above it and add that on here. On a 4104, you can have up to 3 additional line keys for a total of 4 line appearances on your primary. On a 7810, that's 5. Otherwise, if I'm defining a line, I'm actually selecting a different line on here. Speed dial is functionally the same. DSS BLF is similar. These phones don't have a dedicated do not disturb key anywhere, either on screen or physical button. So in order to manage D&D, it is managed through this key type. Call pickup is available, just like with all the other phones we've looked at. The DSS BLF key, when it's shown in a ringing state, will show will allow for a directed call pickup on the monitored lines, so usually that's how things are managed. But because these older models have so many fewer lines compared to so many fewer keys compared to the newer generations, this call pickup function was more common in cases where, oh, I hear someone else's phone ringing, I'm going to hit call pickup, and then I just know their extension. So I'm going to hit call pickup, dial the extension, and pick up the call. We keep it in there for continuity on the newer models, but generally, again, given number of keys, that's not necessary. We also talked about park. These phones, rather than having a single park option, have a park and an unpark as two separate keys. You'll also notice that unlike the other phones we've looked at here, park and unpark are just a feature activator, and then you either have to dial or have a speed dial key set up to perform the rest of the action. Whereas on the newer phones, your park key is associated with a specific destination to give you some more control and more access. You'll also notice there is no setup phone. These phones upload their configuration in a different way, so we can better sync configuration between what's on the phone itself and what's in the UC, so that the setup phone is not used the same way you do it on the newer models. And then finally, these phones do have a dedicated presence key as opposed to coming in and using your user portal or a soft phone to set your presence. It's a little clunky because you change everything through the keypad, and so you'll hit your presence key and then you kind of work through your options 1 through 9 to see what you want to use, but it is there and does allow for some basic presence management through the phone. Finally, on the 7810, key types are going to be very similar to the 4104. Difference is the main key types that we see here. We can set a label on them because this, unlike the 4104, has 10 primary keys, and those keys are all on display. The other things I will note is the 7810 does have an optional sidecar module for an additional 30 keys that's known as the 8030X. If it's installed, the phone can support a total of 40 multifunction keys, the first 10 being on screen and the remaining 30 being based on paper labels. Again, unless you're seeing these deployed generally in a long-standing deployment or you're supporting specific installations such as, I called Frank out, such as Frank does for SCIF environments, which is something that can be a great business to be in. But unless you're in one of those specialty environments, I really wouldn't expect you to see too much of these. But I did want to cover what the differences are here and how to think about these different models if you do come across them. Again, everything we've covered here and the reason we spent most of our time on the Fir and Cedar is those phones and functionality like that is what you can expect to see on any new deployment. But we do want to make sure if you're supporting an older device for whatever reason, you have that backing and that basic background to understand how they differ and how they operate. Again, for all these models, in addition to everything we've covered here, and in addition to built-in help, they do also have quick start guides and install guides that go into a lot more detail on a lot of what I've covered today. Really appreciate everyone's time as always. Again, this was based on feedback that I got from previous sessions, so please, if there's more topics you'd like covered or anything that you would find helpful in future sessions, do not feel shy about bringing those up. I know I did promise time for questions, and I'm able to stay on a few extra minutes today. If anyone does have questions about anything we've covered or anything else they'd like to discuss about the UC for a possible future session. Otherwise, I really appreciate everybody joining in. I hope you have a wonderful day.